Thank you so much for the introduction. So I'm Nicole Vogelsinger, aka Wild Boho on social media. And thank you so much to Michaels and to John Bead for having me today. I'm really looking forward to this class. Today we're going to be focusing on ready-made apparel. So embroidering on, I have two cute little baby jackets, baby denim jackets. What I like about this class, though, is that there are so many applications beyond just ready-made apparel. If you are a seamstress, if you are a quilter, you can take what you learned today and add that into things that you've already made, your handmade things. If you don't sew or you don't quilt and you just have ready-made items that you like, a piece of clothing that you just want to add a little personal touch to, this is the class for you. So I'm really excited about that. Let's get started on going through the supplies that we'll need for this class. And I'm going to turn all my lights on. I didn't want to blind you before. Okay, here we go. So we're going to talk about thread first and then the beads because the beads are always my favorite. So the threads that you're going to see me using today, these are all from DMC. This is the Cotton Redder's Mat, and I am very, very excited that Michaels has started carrying these. This thread is not a divisible thread. So what that means is when you pull off a little bit of this thread, you're going to be using it as is. It's not like the other DMC floss that I'm going to show you in a minute. So what you're going to get with this thread, you're going to have thicker stitches that really show up nicely on denim. So you can see, you're going to see this jacket a lot. That's what I used for the main stitches here. And they show up so nicely. Sometimes I feel like embroidery stitches can get a little lost on a bolder color like that denim. And so I figure if you're spending time with your embroidery and your beading, you really want to see what you're stitching and you want to see the results of that. So I go for a nice bold thread to embroider. Now this is the DMC. This is the what you're probably really familiar with. I'm going to cut a little bit here. So this is the stranded thread. So that means that you could use it just as is. This is 6 strands. So if you want a nice bold thread and you can't find this, you can absolutely go for the DMC and just use it exactly as is, all 6 strands. What I like about this though is you can divide it down into however many strands you want. And you're going to see me today using 1 strand for the beading. And so you can see I just pulled that 1 strand out. I've picked colors that match my palette. I like for my beading thread to show up with my beads. And so I figured colors that kind of match, and I'm really good with that. And if this thread shows up through my beads, it's a pretty color and that's okay. So those are the threads that you're going to need. I'm using a water soluble pencil. You're going to see some of my marks that I'm going to make use this. If you prefer to freehand without using something like this, that's totally fine. I freehand a lot of my work, but I sometimes just like to be able to make marks on fabric and they can easily brush away, or a little Q-tip with some water can get those marks to go away. I've got some embroidery scissors. I've got needles. Now, this is my this is my needles. I don't separate them out usually by the size and everything. So I like to say that a good assorted pack of needles is great to have. And we'll talk about the needles more when we get to beading things. But I just like to have a few different needles that I'm working with. This is something that we're going to be using at the end. It's the Heat and Bond Fusible interfacing. This is optional. I'll show you how you can use it for garments, or where you can use it, but I don't always use this. So we'll talk about that more later. And now the beads. So you're going to see me use seed beads. These are the size 8 seed beads in really great colors. I love these. And then I'm also going to be using the size 6 seed beads. I like to have two different sizes because I'm going to show you different techniques for stacking beads. And so I like to have a variety of sizes. And then we're also going to be using bugle beads. So these are the long and narrow beads. And I have a few different colors of those. Those are my beads. Let me push all this aside and we're just going to jump right into the embroidery. So I'm going to be showing you some of the stitches on a piece of fabric just because I think it's easier for you to see the stitch. And then I'm going to show you how we're going to stitch it on the apparel. So I'm starting with the feather stitch. I'm going to take this out of my stand for a minute. So this is the feather stitch. I love this stitch. It is kind of a wandery sort of stitch and it's really fun. You can see this is just, I left this just one straight line and this one I kind of let wander. So I'm going to show you how to get both of those. And I'm going to get some thread here. I'm going to pick a color that will show up nicely. When you're starting to embroider, use about, now I say this, but then if you were watching me and I wasn't on camera, I'm probably breaking all of my own rules. So you decide whether these rules work for you. But start with about 12 inches of thread. And I just tie a little knot at the end. Again, that's optional. I am used to doing it that way. If I don't tie a knot, then I forget that I haven't tied a knot and I end up pulling my thread through and it just gets on my nerves. To thread a thicker thread like this, I kind of just follow the twist in the thread and then I pinch it between my fingers so you can barely see the thread there. And then I bring my needle to the thread. And then the thread has nowhere to go but the needle. It's kind of like forcing it through that. Now, sometimes it gives me problems. Today, it worked perfectly, so that's good. But if it takes you a time or two to thread your needle with a thicker thread, that's fine. I sometimes will even wet the end or use like a little thread conditioner if it's a really tricky sort of thread. Now I'm going to draw lines on this fabric. I don't always start this way at all, but for the benefit of talking through a stitch like this, I'm going to draw 3 lines. So I've got my middle and my right and my left. The feather stitches always worked top to bottom. And you're bringing it up on your middle line. So I'm bringing my thread up right at the top. I'm always holding it with my thumb because this is a stitch that each time you're bringing it down, you're holding onto it until you can secure it. And I'll show you what I mean. So I'm bringing it down on the right-hand side, a little bit lower than where I came out. And I'm going to take it through, but not all the way through because I want to catch it on the middle line again. So I'm coming up in the middle, pulling my needle through, and now I can pull my thread through. So now I'm going to go onto the other side and I'm bringing it down onto that left-hand side. You can see these aren't exactly lining up. You're kind of alternating as you go side by side. And this is a stitch that play around with it and decide what you like the look of because I could bring it up higher, I could bring it down lower. Like it really is a very versatile stitch. So I'm taking it down and remember I'm catching it with my thumb and I'm going to bring my needle up in the center again. Just like that. So to just make the very classic feather stitch, the back and forth, that is all you need to do. You're bringing it up in the center to anchor it, and you're going down on the sides. This is a good stitch to add beads to, and I want to show you how to do that. So I'm just going to keep my thread here, and I'm going to get my size 6 beads. Because I have a thicker thread, I'm just using a larger bead right now. And there's 2 different options with beads when you're working the feather stitch. So I'm going to put a bead on my needle. So I'm just tucking the bead on my thread and kind of forgetting about it right now as I work this stitch. So I'm coming down on the right hand side and I'm holding onto this thread because remember, I don't want to pull it all the way through yet. And then I'm bringing my needle up in the middle. Now this is where you get to make a decision of where you want your bead to fall. So I'm going to pull the stitch through. I can either have it hanging out here on the little end of the feather stitch. Now it is going to move around. So if you don't like how that looks, you can add it this way and then you'll come back at the very end with just a tiny little stitch and you can put it right over that line and it'll secure the bead there. What I like to do though, I don't always like to see the beads moving around on the little feathery part of the stitch. And so I just kind of move it so that it's in the center. And that's what I did here. I have my bead hanging out on the center of that stitch. And so I'm just going to bring it down on the other side. I'm going to do another bead. I'm going to do it like every other bead. So I'm bringing it up in the middle. And I'm going to go down on the side and bring one more bead. So I've got my bead on my needle, tuck it away and forget it. Go down on the side. Remember, you want to anchor your stitch so you're bringing it up. And then I like to just shift that bead and I'm kind of putting it, you're just moving the bead where you want it to go. Just like that. And I'm going to do one more over here and then I want to show you how to end the feather stitch. So I've come to the end just like this. I'm going to take it out of my hoop stand. To secure this stitch, you're just going to take it down just like you normally would, but I'm going right in the middle. So I'm kind of just anchoring it there, just like that. And then when I have excess thread like this, I take it behind and I just run it under a few of the stitches. Because I have beads and because this is going to be on apparel, I tie a knot because the clothing, you're going to be wearing it, you're going to be washing it, and I sometimes even do 2 knots. I feel like just having the knots um, gives me a little bit of security for when I am wearing my article of clothing. So now let's look at it on this piece of clothing. So here I did this jacket. You can see this feather stitch looks a little different. So when you're looking at your piece of apparel and deciding what you want to do with it, I like to look at sections. What sections are already here? There's a few decisions that you can make. Now, this is a tiny little jacket. It's great to use for demonstrations. Um, I think it's a size, yeah, it's a 24-month jacket. The pocket area is super tiny on this jacket. And so trying to stitch and get your needle in and out of this pocket as you're doing the apparel. When I was doing the sample, it was not working. I know that this is just going to be a sample jacket. And if you have a little kiddo who's going to be wearing this, they probably aren't wearing the pockets or using the pockets. So I made the decision to stitch right through the pockets. So you'll see here that my stitches go right through. So this pocket was kind of made unusable. It's a decorative pocket. I was fine with that decision. If this is a piece of clothing that you're wearing, if it's like a woman-sized or an adult-sized garment, you're going to have a little bit more leeway in that area. And you might be able to take your needle in and out of the pocket and not go completely through. So that's just one of the little decisions that you have to make with apparel. So I'm going to rethread my needle and I'm going to show you how I got started with this stitch on the jacket. So remember, I took a little bit more than my 12 inches. I'm already breaking my own rules. Totally fine. And I just kind of give that a little twist. And I'm going to thread the needle again. If you're nervous about stitching directly on your jacket or whatever it is that you're going to be embroidering, first of all, don't be scared because what's the worst that happens? You take out your stitches and you restart. but it is helpful sometimes to take away the like scared factor of stitching and just use a piece of fabric. I always have like a random fabric and hoop that I can practice stitches on. So I am making sure that I'm coming up. Now, remember, I already said I'm going to be working my way through this pocket. I'm not using an embroidery hoop for this. Again, that's something that you can decide on with your garment. This is a tiny little area that I'm stitching, and the fabric, there's a lot of fabric. It's kind of thick, and I'm able to hold it in place without an embroidery hoop. If I were doing a really large piece like this, that might get tiring to your hands. So just be aware of that and use a hoop when you think it's necessary. I'm going to draw my 3 lines here just so you can, they might not show up super great, just so you can kind of eyeball what I'm doing. So yes, there's my lines, very free-handed. I'm bringing my needle up in the middle and I'm coming down on the side. And I'm going through several layers. My needle is a thicker needle. When you're deciding what needle to use, you want to make sure that if you're using beads with it, that the beads fit over the needle. I had already tested this particular needle. Um, so that's just something to also think about as you're stitching. Can beads pass over the needle? To make this stitch more wandery, and because I have a bigger area in here to fill, the fun thing with a feather stitch is I can keep extending it. So rather than going back over to the right, I'm going to go a little further left, take my needle down, and now I'm bringing it up and I'm lining it up with the previous stitch and pulling it all the way through. And then I can do that one more time. I can go over a little bit more because I have a little bit more here. And I'm going to bring it up. You can see it's lining up right about with that previous stitch. Just like that. And then I can start working my way back. I think this is a really fun stitch if you're trying to do something botanical, or it can look like coral, it can look like a vine, like it's just a nice natural looking stitch. And so you can see I'm just kind of like wandering it in this section. So this is something that you can play around with on your fabric in a hoop before you get to your actual apparel to see what works for you. And you'll get the feel of also stitching through um, several layers of fabric with this sort of project. But I love how this thread really shows up nicely on the denim and it doesn't get lost with all the other stitching that's here because, denim is stitched. So see, I've filled up this little area here, and we're going to do more with this section. So if I were not on camera right now, I would be sitting and I would be filling up this whole section just like that. But now I'm going to end this. And so I'm just taking my needle, and I can even scoop a little fabric up with it if I really, really want to make it secure, and just tie a nice little knot like that. And again, I always get a little nervous with beads and clothing and everything, so I will just give myself a little security and tie 2 knots before cutting it off. And I leave about that much thread. So I don't have to worry about what the back looks like because I'm going to show you how we can cover that up. I also don't have to worry about stitches, any of these threads showing through on the front because this is a darker fabric. It's a darker denim. If you were working on a lighter fabric, that is something that you'd have to pay attention to. But on a jacket like this, that's all going to be hidden away and you don't see any of that. So now we have our feather stitch. I want to show you the next layer that we can add to our stitches. and that is the lazy daisy and a double lazy daisy, and then the different ways that we can add bugle beads to this stitch. So I'm going to put it back in here.
Hi,
Okay.
Nicole. It's Carmi.
Yes, hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Just looking at the sidebar, people
Yeah.
are obviously very impressed with your ability to do this without marking the design in advance. That's not
Yes,
normal for you, right? You're eyeballing it and having fun?
I am. It really, I think that something like this, it is best to just experiment on a piece of fabric like this, because then after a while, you really get the feel of it and the sense of how the stitch is going to look. And then it's kind of like you're just flowing it into an area, which is,
Perfect.
I think that's fun with this sort of project.
And Kathy also wanted to ask you, do you ever vary the length of your stitches?
You can, yes. So with the feather stitch especially, as I'm coming up in the center, if I came if I brought my needle up, and I'll just show you a little bit here. So if I brought my needle, I'm going to take it to the side and I'm going to bring it up here. So now my next stitch, if I were to make that, if I wanted them to look kind of smaller and I didn't want the bars to be quite as extended, what I would do is bring it down like normal. But then instead of bringing it up about here, which is what I was doing, where you bring the needle up in the center kind of changes how that looks. So I'm bringing it up now really close to that. And you can see, hopefully it'll show, you can see it's making like a much more compact line. And if you keep doing that, it changes the look of it. It almost looks like curvier rather than straighter. Does that make sense? Um, so yes, you can change the length of those stitches. You're still going to get the feathered look of the stitches going on either side.
Right. Thank you, Nicole. I think that answers Kathy, and thank you for demonstrating that.
Sure. Okay, so now the lazy daisy. I'm going to just leave this thread threaded and I'm going to do it right here. I love this stitch. You'll see this a lot in my work because it's just a fun stitch to stitch. You can stitch it as a flower or you can stitch individual petals, which is what I'm going to show you right now. So I'm bringing my needle up and then I'm taking it back down in the same hole, but I'm not pulling it all the way through. My thumb's catching it again. And now this is where you decide how long you want your lazy daisy petal to be. So I'm actually going to make it a little bit longer because I want to fill this. And so you're bringing your needle up and then you just take it down on the outside of that little stitch to anchor it. So you'll have like a little bar up there. I'm going to do another one right next to it. So these you're going to see me work singly, but you could stitch 5 of them together in a flower shape and you get an easy flower that you're stitching. So I've brought my needle up and down and now I'm going to anchor it again. I'm not pulling super tight at this point because I want there to be some fluff with this stitch. I don't want it so tight that it like makes the stitch skinnier. That's what will happen if you pull it really, really tight. So as I'm bringing it up and then making the stitch and then anchoring it, when I do the final anchor stitch, I'm just kind of like lightly pulling my thread like that to give me the petal shape and then anchoring it. Now I'm going to cut this thread without tying it off in the back. So don't follow that example either. I'm giving you plenty of things not to do as I do. So enjoy that. Okay, I'm going to take one more thread so that I can show you what it will look like to do a double lazy daisy. So 2 of these I'll do as doubles. So this is just going to be my single lazy daisy. And that is a great stitch. In my example here, you can see that I did just single lazy daisies in different colors, and I just varied where I placed them on the ends of the feather stitch. So that's why I really like these two stitches together, because the feather stitch gives you that nice long vine, and then the lazy daisy gives you something to put on the ends of those vines or the little feathers. So I'm going to thread this needle. Now this is a double lazy daisy, and it's so easy, and you get so much bang for your buck with how it looks. So I'm bringing my needle and thread inside of this lazy daisy stitch that I already stitched. I'm going to be making it a little bit smaller than the first stitch so that it fits inside nicely. And I'm working it the same exact way. I'm taking my needle down, holding on to the thread until I anchor it, and I'm anchoring it slightly smaller. And then I'm pulling my thread through. And again, I don't want it to be super tight. So using two different colors with this, I think is a really fun way to add. It's just one stitch that you're learning, but it adds a lot of visual interest. I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm going to make one more. Okay. And just like that, anchor it. Okay. Now you could leave it just like that, but why not add a few beads for a little extra sparkle? So I'm going to add some bugle beads to this. And let's see, I'll add a green one so that it shows up nicely with these two. So with bugle beads, the one thing that you do want to be aware of is, can your needle pass through them? And I always test it before threading my thread. I think I have a needle here that I already threaded, but maybe I don't. Okay. So I like to pick my needle, and before I thread it and go to that effort, I'll pick up a bead and I'll make sure that the bead can pass over the needle. The worst feeling is getting your needle all threaded, and sometimes it can be tricky with the thinner threads, and then realizing that your bead doesn't pass over the needle. And I speak from experience because I still do it a lot. So I'm threading this, I'm using one strand of that DMC, the stranded floss, and I'm bringing my needle up inside of this, of the double lazy daisy. Just right at the, oops, I pulled my thread through. Just right at the base of both of your stitches, but inside the stitch. And I'm going to put a bugle bead on, and I just pull it over the needle, and then I kind of lay it down to see where it ends or where it falls on the stitch. And that's where I'm going to bring my needle down. Just like that. So you can see it's adding, it's a nice layer. I'll add one more here. It's a nice layer, and when you're working with apparel, I think that just any extra visual interest and the little sparkle of that really is a nice touch. So I'll lay the bead down so you can see about where it's going to fall, and then you just take your needle down. Now, as you stitch more with that, I don't always lay my needle down. I'll show you with this one. I take my bead, I put it on the needle, and then I just take my needle down about where I know the bead is going to fall. You start to get a feel for the sizes of the beads and about how long they are and where they fall on your work. So those are the lazy daisies. Now let me show you that on the jacket. We're working over here. So that's my beading needle. And let's see, I think we're going to use this lighter pink color. You also don't have to use two different colors. If you just want your lazy daisy to look a little bit thicker, you can do two of the same color, which I might do on this to see how that looks too. There's so much variety that you can just play around with when you're stitching something like this, and it just elevates a very simple stitch. Okay, thread your needle. And I'm not going to do a lazy daisy on every one of these because I'm also going to be adding sequins and beads. So I might just add a few here. So I'm bringing my needle and thread up. Now, when you are doing a lazy daisy and you have a thicker thread and your very first stitch, just be aware of where your knot is on the back of your work so that you're not going through the knot and making a mess for yourself. So I'm holding it with my finger behind the jacket to make sure that I don't go through that knot. And remember, you're not pulling all the way through because you want to anchor it. I'm kind of gauging about how big I want this stitch to be. Not pulling super tight. And I'm going to add another one inside of there, same color. Using the same color, it's just going to make this look like a much thicker stitch, which again, I like to see the stitches that I'm stitching on my apparel. And again, not pulling super tight, tucking that needle down then and anchoring the stitch. So you see it's a very pretty petal when you use two of the same colors. It's a completely different look to the stitch, which is so much fun that one stitch can be stitched and just changing the colors of the inner and outer stitch makes it look completely different. So I'll add another one here for you. Okay, and then one more inside. Now, if you didn't want to add beads to your feather stitch while you were stitching it, which you can see on this example I didn't do, I can come back after the fact and add beads, and I'm going to show you that next. So I'm just going to secure this little stitch. And because it is on a piece of fabric that I'm wearing, I'm definitely making sure to run my stitches behind and just tie a little knot. This one doesn't have beads on it, so I'm okay with just one knot. And I'll just run it through another one. Okay. So now what else can we do with a feather stitch? Again, my answer is always add beads because that is just what I love to do. So I'm going to get my size 8 seed beads. You can see that the size 8 beads are a little bit smaller than the size 6 that I was using. And that's great because we're going to be stacking them. So I'm going to get my needle and I'm pulling my one strand of thread. You can see for all of these stitches, I've just been using the same color with my bugle beads and with all the different colors. This one color thread just has worked really well for all of these different colors that I'm using. Okay, so I have my thread knotted and I'm just going to pick one of these spots. We're going to start right at the bottom. I'm bringing my needle up and I'm pulling the thread till I feel the knot. And then I'm going to take one of the larger seed beads and I'm going to take one of the smaller ones. Now, the smaller one I'm holding on to, and I'm going to go back down through that larger bead.
Hey, Nicole, can you try to say something? Because it paused for a quick second, so I wanna make sure I know you already had internet issues earlier today. Hey hey, Millie, can you hear me? Or Carmy?
Yes, we hear you. I think maybe
We can
her.
hear you.
Okay. I'm not for sure if, Nicole hears anybody at the moment. As a matter of fact, I think her audio is on mute. Hush.
Oh, there we go. Can you hear me now?
There we go.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So let me show you that again. We are going to bring the needle and thread up. I'm putting my size 6 seed bead on, and I'm just letting it sit right there on the fabric. And then I'm going to grab my size 8 seed bead, and this is the one that I'm holding on to as I go back down through the bead. So that pink bead is now my anchor bead. Now, if you've seen me do other work, this is the part where I think I might have froze before. I'm coming through the green bead and I'm just anchoring it one more time just to be safe so that this bead wouldn't fall off as I'm wearing this. Well, I'm not going to be wearing this jacket, but you know what I mean. So from the side, you can see there's a little bit of height there. If you've seen my work before, you know that I love to add a lot of dimension and a lot of layers of beads to my embroidery. However, on apparel or on a quilting, if you're adding this to a quilt, you want to think about the dimension. This is about all I will do. Normally, I'll stack like a larger bead and then a bugle bead and then a tiny bead on top. But for apparel, because you're going to be wearing it, because it's going to be rubbing against your purse or your seat belt, I am just aware of what I'm doing with beads and how much dimension I'm actually adding. So this bead stacking is about what you will see me do. There's also add a sequin, and I didn't mention this at the beginning, but I love these sequin tubes. These are from Michaels. I think I normally find them in the scrapbooking section of the store, but they are an excellent variety pack of sequins, and they're nice and tiny. So they add like a little bit of shimmer to your project, and they're not like going overboard. So you can just add a little sequin super easily, put it on your needle, and just one tiny little stitch will secure it, just like that. But you can also add a bead to it. So I'll put the sequin down as the base, and then I'll get one of the smaller beads, and I can either do the same thing that I did with the bead stack. I can go through the sequin, and then that bead is securing it. It's giving it a tiny bit of shine because they're about the same size, but that's kind of nice. But I could also take my sequin. I'm going to put the sequin on and the bead. Just like that. And then I'm just doing my one little stitch to secure it. And that it just is a different look. Like you see a little bit more of the sequin that way. So those are the different ways to add um, beads and sequins to that. And yes, these are tiny little sequins. You can definitely use, I mean, go all out with your sequins. This just adds like a tiny bit of bling to the project. You can see in this section here, what I did is I just scattered sequins and beads throughout this whole area. This is just something that the more you play with it, the more fun you can have with it, and you can learn different ways that you like to use these embellishments. So that is the feather stitch, that is the double lazy daisy, and the bead stacks. So now let me show you. I should secure this like I keep telling you to do. I'm just going to tie one little knot here. And then I'm going to take you back to my practice hoop. Okay. So what I'm going to show you next is I did these little, they're kind of like little suns, kind of like little flowers. You can decide what shape they are. Here's another one. This one definitely looks more flowery. So this is a satin stitch. For some reason, whenever I talk about satin stitch, people get a little bit scared because they think it has to look absolutely perfect and your stitches all have to line up perfectly, and it's just a little scary. I'm here to tell you that it is not. And it is a nice, simple stitch that can add a lot of dimension to your work. So I'm going to do it in another color that will show up nicely. And I just drew my little free-handed circle. And I'm going to thread that needle. Oops, I think that was a different needle I had been using. Here's my needle. Sometimes the eye of the needle definitely does matter because of the thicker thread. Don't drive yourself crazy by picking a too small needle. Okay, so for satin stitch, you see I have my circle here. I bring my needle up in the center of the circle. Any shape that I'm filling in, this is always how I start it. It's like I'm making kind of an outline of the stitches, and I fill one half and I fill the other half. And if I was doing a larger section, I would give myself a few guiding stitches like this, because that's what helps to keep your stitches nice and lined up when you're working on a satin stitch. So that's my little trick, working it in sections. So now, because this is a circle, I'm just making each stitch a little bit smaller, nice and close together with that stitch, with your previous stitch. So you want them to almost, they're not overlapping, but they're nice and tight together, and that's what's going to give you a full stitch. I think one more on this side, and then I'll do the other side. So there's half of my circle. Now, I told you that I don't usually make the marking lines when I'm doing the feather stitch or the other stitches. Satin stitch is a stitch that I do like to have my lines marked so that I can see what I'm filling up, what area I'm filling. That's important. And one more stitch. Just like that. So now I'm going to cut this thread. You could do just this stitch if you wanted to just do little dots all over something. This is a great stitch to do that. I also think it's an excellent stitch to layer beads, and so that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to grab my beading needle, and remember, with your needle, you just want to pass a bugle bead through it to make sure. See, this one doesn't pass through that needle. Oh, it kind of does. That makes me a little nervous, though. I think I'm going to spill some sequins and pick a different needle. We'll try that again. There we go. Don't waste time threading needles that aren't going to work with your beads. So let's see. We're going to grab some of this stranded thread in a green because I'm going to be adding green beads. And I'm just pulling one little strand off. If I'm doing embroidery that is like if you're adding little eyes or tiny little details to something, I often will use just one strand of embroidery floss like this. But for the majority of my projects, again, I use thick threads and I really like to see them. So I tend to use all 6 strands of embroidery floss. Okay, so I have my needle threaded. And I'm going to be stitching a little flower shape. So I'm going to bring my needle up through my satin stitched circle. Just like that. And this thread, it's very thin, so you're barely going to even notice it through your stitches. And I'm going to put a bugle bead on. And then I'm just going to lay it down like this and take my needle down right where it ends. And so I'm going to do that all the way around this little satin stitch. My desk normally has spilled sequins and beads on it, so this is very real for how I normally work. So you're seeing how wild boho truly is. After I finish a project, my desk is always a mess, and I have to completely reset it before working on anything else. I have these little bead trays, but end up just all over the place. So I just tell myself that's how creativity happens, right? So I'm going to take these down. I normally like to work in odd numbers of things, but I felt that 6 worked really well on that little shape. So we'll see if that works again today. I think we might just need 5. I'm leaving an open area in the center so that I can add more beads. Okay, so you could just leave it this way. It's very pretty. I think that's a nice little detail, but let's add a center of beads. Let's see. I'll use the pink ones since I already have those out. This is a tiny little circle, and I want the beads to kind of stand off of the circle a little bit. So I am putting 3 beads on my needle. If I were laying them down and making sure that my needle extended just like I did with seed beads, it would be off of the flower. I don't want that. So instead, I'm making a tiny stitch, which gives the beads nowhere to go, but in a tiny little, like rainbow shape, like a little arch. So you can see from the side. I love that because it gives it more dimension. So let's take it to the jacket. And I want to show you how that looked on the jacket. I probably won't stitch that just for time, but I did want to show some of the other things that can be done. So here I did that on the jacket. You can see each little arch of beads kind of stands off from the side. This is about how much dimension you're getting with this. You can see that here is where I did my stack of size 6 and size 8 seed beads. And then when you're working on apparel like this, look at what lines are here and what you have to work with. When I was looking at this, this was the first section that I did, just like today, and I filled in the section. And then I was looking at other parts and I really liked this little pocket area. And so that's where I just began stitching my seed beads just as like a little edge. So I could definitely do way more with this. I wanted to keep it simple and I have a tendency to go a little overboard. So for simplicity's sake, this is all I did. But you could use these lines down here. You could add little beads to that whole thing. There's really so much that you can do. If I did stitch around these buttons because this is not a functional button. So you want to think about if you had stitched all the way around these buttons. Is this something that you're going to be like pulling at all the time? It might not be the best idea to stitch with a lot of beads there. So just think of how you're going to use your garment. How are you going to wear it? As you're embroidering it, just think through those little details that might annoy you about something later. So now, what do you do when you're done with this? Well, you could leave it as is. On a hoop, I call this my hoop guts. This is the back part of your stitching, and I always say that you should be proud of your stitches. You spent a lot of time getting to this point, and I really think there is a beauty in what's behind all of this. However, garments are a little bit different, and you need to think about protecting your stitches. So this is heat and bond. It's a fusible interfacing, and I want to show you what it looks like on a jacket when it's attached. So this is, I cut just around the pocket area. You can cut little shapes with this. This protects my stitches from, I think to me, it feels like one more form of security that everything's not going to fall apart on you. Always follow the directions that are given, but it is very easy to work with. You're going to see when you open this up, you can see my little piece that I cut. There is a side of it that feels rough and bumpy. That's what is going to adhere to your jacket. So I'm going to show you how you could cut. You can see I can just cut little shapes. Looking at this piece here, I'm going to move this one out of the way. I don't need to cut one giant piece for this whole area. I can just cut a shape and decide like, oh, I want it a little bit smaller. I want it in a circle. I want it to cover this one little patch of stitching. And you can easily cut it, lay it down on your stitches. I would tuck any loose threads under it. With your iron, it gives all the instructions here, but you do want to use like a pressing cloth on top of this as you iron. This rough part does have part of it that is adhesive, and you don't really want to get that on your iron. This is a lightweight adhesive. For some of my projects, I use like the heat and bond that is a heavier adhesive, and when it gets on your iron, it can just make a huge mess. So you don't want to do that, and you don't want to ruin your fabrics. So this is denim. It's pretty durable, and I didn't have any concerns about ironing this to the fabric. But again, if you were working on a shirt that was like a wispier material or a cotton, just be aware of the fabric that you're ironing onto and follow the directions. It's very easy, and it does give me just that little extra security that I need with a garment to make me feel like, okay, my stitches are protected. I'm not going to be pulling any threads from the back. It just covers everything up and makes it feel better. So I hope you enjoyed this. It looks complicated, but it is definitely not meant to be complicated. This is a really great beginner project. I always recommend having this, just a little scrap of fabric to work on. And then you don't have to be scared about embroidering directly onto it. But then just bite the bullet and actually do embroider, because it's good. Nothing bad can happen. You can only cut out your threads and cut out your beads and start over again. So I hope you enjoyed this, and happy stitching.